Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm truly happy and more or less delighted to present some of the work that we did in relation to cover crops in here in Nevada. I will share my views with you in relation to cover crops. I know that we have, audience with, varying interests from, maybe a small kitchen garden right on to large scale farmers. So I'll try to cover different aspects of cover crops in relation to, soil health and also as a forage crop because, before cover crops were, not intended to harvest for anything except, it's there for basically restoration activities in the soil. But nowadays, the focus has been shifted slightly. The youth as a multiple utilization um, focus in relation to soil health restoration and the forage benefits. So that will capture maybe some producers in terms of utilizing cover crops in their cropping systems. Okay, so what I'll cover today with you, we'll go over quickly a definition of cover crop to make it clear that we're in the same, path. And then I'll provide some brief benefits of cover crops, which I think you maybe already gathered or know. And then I'll talk a little bit about cover crop systems and decision. And then I'll provide some updates in relation to our research work in these winter annual cover crops, where we look at the forage benefits, the biomass density. I'll talk about that, why it's important, and forage quality index. And then I'll talk about the soil health parameters, which are very, very important in relation to cover crop. I kind of start, maybe for some, will like to see me start with the soil health parameters first, but I like to cover the plant component first before I move on to the soil health parameters in relation to cover crops. So I kind of pulled this definition from the Soil Science Society of America in relation to cover crop. When we talk about cover crop, we're talking about those close growing that provide some form of soil protection and soil improvement between periods of normal crop production. And so that is very important to keep in mind. Sometimes it can be plowed or incorporated into the soil. And as a result of that, it can be referred to as green manure crops. So in relation to benefits of cover crops, here we focus on agroecosystem services, basically. What if you're in a kitchen garden or you have a large scale farm? If you incorporate cover crops into your agricultural system, the first thing that comes to mind is relation to water and wind erosion control. So you have that structure there, more or less, to hold the soil together. And that can prevent, if there is rapid runoff, that can prevent or mitigate erosion to a great extent. Or if there is heavy wind, that too. And then another benefit of cover crop is where it can sequester soil organic carbon, largely linked to root development, which I'll talk a little bit later. And then we have the importance of decreased soil compaction. Very important. These cover crop, the rooting structure, which I'll talk a little bit later, are very important in relation to reduction in soil compaction. And so as a result of that, which I'll talk a little bit about later again, that when we talk about, this compaction, then we have to think carefully in terms of our selection of cover crop species to use to help improve, or reduce soil compaction. The other thing we want to talk about in relation to cover crops, the ability to increase water infiltration. So that is very important under our semi-arid condition. And then increase soil aggregate stability, very important in terms of reducing erosion and so on. these cover crops are, generally they can produce what we call organic binding agent that can really glue that soil together and prevent it from loss from either water or wind erosion and so on. And then it's a source also, the cover crop, through mineralization. That is essentially, when it's being the plant tissue or the biomass, being decomposed basically by microbes. And so that the N in that biomass can be released for plant uptake at some point. And so that is another important benefits of cover crops. And so we can go on in relation to benefits. I would like to cover a few more in relation to benefits of cover crops. The leguminous cover crop, because of their natural ability to convert atmospheric nitrogen into nitrogen that are readily available for plant uptake, it is very important when you're thinking about cover crop systems, maybe to consider the inclusion of a legume component within that cover crop mixture that you're talking about. Increasing soil organic matter, we know that with increased soil organic matter, we have increased water holding capacity of the soil, we have increase in nutrient holding capacity of the soil. And so as a result of that, cover crops, very, very important. And we can talk about, the reduction in loss, because we know nitrate, can be readily leached out of the soil and cause aquatic impairment in terms of water, waste, and so on. And so cover crop, inclusion can help to take up some of that nitrate before and prevent, leaching loss. And so we have this overall improve in nutrient recycling. That is something I'll talk about later, because if you were to plow back that cover crop into the soil, then over time with decomposition, that nutrient will become readily available for the intended crop or the subsequent crop uptake and so on. Another important aspect is the microbial community of the soil, which is very, very important in terms of the overall health of the soil. And then we don't often talk a lot about this, but the integration of cover crops in your system, particularly with that period that can be considered fallow or bare ground, very important in terms of weed suppression, which I'll talk about how we can relate some of these cover crop parameters, the biomass, to weed suppression. And then, there are evidence to show that with cover crop, followed by a subsequent crop, you can have improvement in crop yield, largely as a result of improvement in relation to the soil parameters. And then I like to talk because, a lot of times producers, want some additional incentive, because I'll kind of summarize, in relation to cover crop and soil parameters. But importantly, it can be an important animal feed, more so in this environment where high quality pastures might be limited. And so I like to look at that component in these studies that I've conducted in relation to providing that additional benefit for producers who desire to incorporate cover crops into their system. So, cover crop systems. If you were to think of incorporating cover crops, be it your kitchen garden or your large scale farming operation, the first thing you'll want to think about, is what species to plant. I will cover that in terms of, helping you to make decision in relation to that. What seeding rates to use, I'll cover that. And then time of planting, I'll talk a little bit about that. And then termination date. When do you terminate your cover crop if you were to follow with a subsequent crop thereafter? There are a number of considerations that you have to take, you have to think of in relation to termination date and so on. So when we talk about species, like in general crop production agriculture, when we talk about cover crops, for example, and you talk about what species you want to use, cover crop species, we can talk first about whether if you're going to use a cool season, species, or you're going to use a warm season species. Here I focus primarily on cool season species. So you have to look at the adaptation of that cover crop species to your environment. That is very, very important. And I will provide some evidence of that in terms of the research work that we've conducted here. The other thing that you have to think about, the availability of the seed. And then you start to think a little bit more critically, quantitatively, what are the amount of biomass residue you desire? And then you can go on further and you can think of weed management goals. And so I'll talk about this a little because weed management, I consider to be very, very important in crop production or agriculture. And cover crop can help in relation to reduction of that weed load, mitigate maybe much of the expense in terms of purchasing of herbicide for weed control and so on. So we'll talk about that. Then after you kind of get that lined up in relation to species to be planted, then you have to think about seeding method. And that is so important because, you might think of a kitchen garden, for example, and maybe it's a small area. So the likelihood you'll broadcast the seed there compared to large scale farming operation where, you're more inclined to drill the seed into the land, okay, the soil. So you have to think about that. So if you think about that, then your seeding rate can vary because typically, if you were to broadcast seed, because there's that limitation in terms of seed to soil contact, then germination rate will reduce and overall establishment of that crop might be limited as a result of poor seed to soil contact, poor moisture uptake for germination to occur. And therefore, it is highly recommended that under that kind of scenario, you might want to increase your seeding rate, 1.5 times compared to maybe drill seeding. Okay, so you take that into consideration. Then another thing you have to take into consideration is the desired biomass. Typically, when it relates to seeding rate, to a point, there are, recommended seeding rates out there. If you call any seeding company, they can provide you with that information, or extension educator, they will provide you with that information in relation to seeding rate. But, studies would have shown in relation to cover crop and even other crop agriculture is that as you increase the seeding rate, you can increase biomass production to an extent, and then it will kind of plateau. So you have to take that into consideration, the desired amount of biomass. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, not only from an animal point of view, animal perspective in relation to biomass production, but also countering, weed suppression effect and so on. You'll have to take seed cost into consideration too, in relation to your seeding rate, and then your weed management goal, because it's really critical. I can tell you the reason why I keep talking about weed management. That is a major problem under our conditions here. That just about any crop you cultivate, you're going to encounter a fair amount of weeds. Even a kitchen garden, you can encounter a fair amount of weeds, more so out in, large scale agriculture setting. All right, so there I kind of provided that framework for you in relation to how you should think pertaining to cover crop use and integration into your system. So you can pose the question to yourself and say, I want to focus primarily on soil health improvement, or I want a combination of soil health improvement and also I want the additional biomass with qualitative management in terms of animal feeding value. So if you were to think along the line, then you have to be very careful in terms of how you integrate these cover cropping systems into your setting, you know. And so that is very important. So what I'm going to do now, basically, I will present two studies to you in relation to cover crops that we've covered. And they're all, winter annuals. Okay. And so what I'll do, I'll go through them. I will not talk a lot about the methodology in terms of experimental design and so on. I don't think that is too relevant here, but I'll talk about the results largely and, initially what were, the objectives of the study. So, we kind of justify the first one by pointing to beyond soil health, high quality biomass production for animal feeding will be an added incentive to integrate cover crop into existing cropping systems. Okay, so we can think of the microbial community structure, but then we can also, in terms of soil improvement, we can think about, the soil physical chemical properties, from bulk density to penetration, compaction. We can think about, the organic matter components. We can think about the residual nitrogen and all the stuff we can think about. But if we add another important component, which is the biomass for forage quality, then we have to be truly careful in terms of, or even more careful in terms of our integration or selection of cover crops into, that we'll use for our cover crop system, okay? So our first study basically is where we try to quantify the above and below ground biomass because it's important, not only from an animal feeding perspective, but, if you think about nutrient recycling, that litter decomposition, if you should incorporate back that into the soil, then, I would assume, that the greater biomass production, the greater amount of nutrient that can be recycled back into the soil. Okay, and so we'll cover a little bit in terms of forage and nutritive value. And then we look at the effects of these different winter annual cover crop systems on soil health parameters. So when you start to think, and here that I'm providing you directly with what we did in relation to these cover crop systems. Now, when you think of cover crop systems, you can either decide that you want a monoculture, which is a single species, or you want a mixture. You can have, maybe a binary, or you can have polycultures, 3 or more species in the mix. Okay, so when we think about these cover crops, the other thing we have to think about, they're grass. You can have legumes. The legumes, they have the ability to fix nitrogen. So you can think about that. They have a different rooting structure compared to grass, fibrous root compared to taproot. So with that taproot, maybe you have greater penetration into the soil. So that kind of serve as a biological tiller to reduce soil compaction. While in the case of the fibrous root system, they are more right closely to the soil surface and will not be so impactful in terms of, reducing soil compaction. So all of that you can think of. And that is why oftentimes you find folks will go for mixtures compared to a single species, be it grass or legume. And then you have the broadleaves, which we'll talk about in another study. Okay, so I want to make that distinction that, to try to basically separate the legumes from the broadleaf, because here we're talking about the brassicas. Okay, and so you think about that. The other thing that if you're in a large scale operation per se, you'll want to think about, some form of security, okay, in relation to this cover crop. Because if, for instance, maybe let's say there's really limited moisture, then maybe the plant species with deeper rooting system will able to obtain moisture to survive, and then you'll not have total crop failure. So there's a security involvement in mixtures compared to monoculture. Okay, and so we have these mixtures. Typically what we'll do, we follow the recommended seeding rate for these species, and we plant on a pure live seed basis. So basically what we're saying here is that there's an expectation for 100% germination, when you calculate it on a pure live seed basis. Now for the mixtures, again, this is a really critical component because, the mixtures here are based on the seed mass ratio. So we look at the recommended rate for each individual species, for example, and then for for example, cover crop species 1, which is annual ryegrass, faba bean, and yellow sweet clover. So we argue that we want 50% ryegrass based on seed mass ratio, right? 25% faba bean and 25% sweet clover. So that is how we decide on the mixture. But I can tell you, it was not that straightforward. You have to take into consideration, the morphological characteristics of these individual species. For example, the grass compared to the broadleaf, the legumes, okay? And so when they start growing together in this mixture, oftentimes you can find one dominating the other. You have shading effect because we know that light is very important for the photosynthetic activity of the plants. And so if you have that shading effect and that competition for all the growth resources, including soil nutrients and water, you can have problems. That problem can be you can have maybe the grass dominated and you have a reduction in the legume component in the sward. So you lose a lot of that natural biological nitrogen fixing capability. And with that decrease in the legume component in the sward, if you were to focus on end of season biomass for forage quality, then you have a decrease in the overall nutritive value as a result of the decrease in the legume component in the sward. So there are a number of things you have to take into consideration from a soil health point of view, the root architecture, from the overall biomass to ensure fair competition, okay, so that you have a good cover. Something else I want to talk about here, I should add, is that with these cover crops, right, I'm going to make it open here now. When we talk about weed suppression, rapid establishment is important because if we, the wheat seed they require, for example, they require light for germination. And so if, the established cover crop were to intercept all that light, then it reduces the ability of wheat seed to germinate. And a result of that, you lower the wheat seed or the wheat population in your system. Very, very important component. So when you think of cover crops, you have to think carefully in terms of their selection and integration in order to realize all the benefits that you want to focus on. So it's not merely just going to pull. The other thing that you'll find happening is that there are a lot of commercial seed producers and they will provide these mixtures to you. But oftentimes those mixtures might not necessarily be well compatible to your environment and your farming system's operation. So that maybe you need to have discussions with the producers and maybe extension educators and so on, so that you have, a better mixture more suited for your environment. Okay, and so you can see we cover annual ryegrass, we cover oats, we cover faba bean, yellow sweet pea, winter pea, and we kind of make them into mixture. The mixture 1, basically, these are 3 species mixtures. So it's oat, faba bean, and winter pea. Okay, we have for mixture 2 and for mixture 1, we have annual ryegrass, faba bean, and yellow sweet clover. Okay, and so we collected these data. So another very important thing, you might ask yourself, if you're a large scale farm or even kitchen garden and you decide that you want to go into subsequent crop, you know, when do I terminate my cover crop, my winter cover crop? So that depends, right? So we'll kind of look at that. You know, what happens basically if you terminate early, like the early harvest, we consider June, or if you terminate late August. And then we look at root biomass, you know, sward height and sample for nutritive value. And then at the end of it, we collected soil samples for soil health parameters. We cover microbial biomass and soil respiration, we'll talk about. And then we cover all, you know, the physical attribute, bulk density and aggregate stability, soil cone index, which is a measure basically of compaction, penetrometer used to do that, and water infiltration rate at the end of the season. Okay, and you know, the data, we analyze the data. Okay, so this, you know, this is like, you know, a picture of our cover crop system. So you have legumes and you have grass. You have annual ryegrass, here you have maybe oats, and then you have the legumes, you know, the faba bean, the winter pea, and the clover, okay? And so I kind of show a picture here in terms of infiltration and, you know, the soil compaction measurement that we did on this stuff. So in relation to this data, as we go along, you know, what I want you to do is to, as we go along, I'll discuss it. I want you to consider the species and the systems to be used. You know, when you think of your farming operation, I want you to think of agro-ecosystem services. Think about weed suppression. Think about nutrient recycling. Think about the soil physical properties. And then for those who are in large scale operation and want to focus too on harvesting this cover crop as part of, you know, the animal feeding thing, then you think about the animal feeding value as we go along. Okay. So from these systems, what we notice in relation to biomass production. So you can have early termination or late termination, right? It depends on your system and what you want to do. Maybe you have a subsequent crop coming up in the fall, or you want to integrate maybe, you know, a summer cover crop, then you think of early termination, okay? And so what happens in terms of biomass? And here I wanted to point out, you know, the monoculture of oats, basically during the early harvest or termination, had similar biomass production compared to, and I'm not going to really call these numbers, but just to provide, I think you can see it clearly on your screen, compared to the cover crop mixture 2. Okay, if we go across to late harvest, for example, we find that, again, the oats and cover crop mixture 2, that cover crop mixture 2 is a combination of oat, faba bean, and winter pea. So clearly what this is telling you, that oat as a cover crop, you know, contributes significantly to overall biomass production. Okay? Another important component, when we compare late, okay, early and late season harvest within each cover crop system, you know, generally for the annual ryegrass, for the oats, for the yellow sweet clover, and for the 2 cover crop mixtures, we have greater biomass production late compared to the early harvest. Okay, so if you are a farmer and you want to focus on maybe getting some feed for your animal during, you know, period of short supply, then you can focus on late harvest because you have greater biomass. However, if you look at faba bean and winter pea, there is no effect of termination date on biomass production. What that means basically, and I'm going to tell you what it means that these faba bean and winter pea, they reach physiological maturity or they stop growing at that stage of early harvest. So there's no addition compared to late harvest. What I want to show you here with this winter pea, very important, is that if you look at these numerical value, for example, at the late harvest, you might ask the question, well, how come at early harvest you had 1,570 kilogram dry matter per hectare, and at late harvest you had 400 kilogram dry matter per hectare? That lower biomass, basically for the winter pea, encourages, proliferation of weeds in those plots. And as a result of that, you have suppression of the winter pea and overall lower biomass production. So maybe even at this stage, perhaps winter pea as a standalone cover crop might not be a very wise choice under large scale cultivation. But if you were maybe to do a garden, for example, a small area, then it might be okay because you have better control. It might be easy to go in there and pull weeds and so on, compared to a large scale operation. So you need to take that into consideration. They're not in large scale operation, they might not be specific herbicide you can use to control broadleaf weeds in a winter pea cover crop system. So that by itself make it even more problematic. So when you think of biomass production, not only from its value in terms of nutrient recycling or biomass for animal feeding, but its implication in terms of either suppression or encouragement of weeds in those plots. So I want you to think of that. Okay, the bulk density and why we measure the bulk density of these crop. There's a strong correlation or relationship with forage or crop bulk density and weed suppression. Okay. And so if you look at all the ones that I highlighted, they are kind of similar for both early and late harvest. They are very similar in terms of their bulk density. That is the quantitatively, the amount of biomass, kilogram of dry matter biomass per centimeter per hectare in terms of height. So that has basically a suppressive effect. And also greater that bulk density, greater light interception, generally you'll find lower weed population under that kind of condition. But if you look at the faba bean and the winter pea, you see generally lower bulk density. And so when we go out there and look at these plots visually, the ones that I've highlighted for both early and late, lower weed population compared to the faba bean and winter pea, kind of start to be dominated by weeds. So again, you can take that into consideration. Okay, the root biomass. So we went on the ground basically. It's a coring method, we call it. And we look at the root biomass because that is important in terms of soil organic matter contribution. It's important in terms of reduction in soil compaction, and so on. And as I mentioned to you earlier, that when you have, these mixtures, like for example, if you have the legumes with taproot, with greater, penetrating ability compared to the fibrous root of grass, you have that mixture, then maybe you can, over time, you can expect, reduction in soil compaction, maybe greater aeration and so on compared to a grass monoculture like the oat and so on. So again, when we look at these, when we look at these, we saw a tendency for the cover crop mixture one, which is annual ryegrass combined with faba bean and yellow sweet clover, to have greater root biomass than the oats or faba bean independently. So that tells you a lot in relation to, options, and, for you to encourage maybe organic matter buildup over time, for your operation. So those are things that you need to consider from, the above ground biomass and below ground biomass point of view in relation to many of these cover crop systems that we're talking about um, in relation to um, these operation. Okay, so next, for many farmers, okay, for many farmers, the quality of the crop is very important, right? The biomass. And here I want to focus largely on the ADF and the neutral detergent fiber concentration for these crops. Because that is very, very important. When we talk about ADF, the acid detergent fiber, you know, that component that is highly related to how much of that forage is digestible, the digestible material. So if you find that you have an increase in, ADF concentration, well, then you have a reduction, generally you have a reduction in digestibility. Once you have a reduction in digestibility, then generally there is lower energy intake from that forage, lower animal performance. When we have, higher NDF, the neutral detergent fiber component, that is linked largely to animal intake, so there's the bulkiness of the forage. As that NDF concentration increases, you find that the forage becomes more bulky, largely associated with maturity of the forage, and therefore what you have is a limitation in animal intake. So you might see, the animal look very round, and pouch, but they're not necessarily nutritionally full. And that can be very harmful in terms of your animal productivity and gains from your animal production system. So I want, this is a critical component for those who are thinking of cover crops with additional benefit as an animal feed. Okay, and so for this study, what we did, because many producers are familiar with relative feed value, which is a standard used in alfalfa hay production. Okay, and so what you find happening, as is typical, right? If you look at these systems, we have the two grasses, annual ryegrass and oat, and then we have the three legumes, faba bean, winter pea, and yellow sweet clover. And then we have the cover crop mixture 1 and mixture 2. So clearly, from a relative feed value point of view, and even these NDF values, as I'm showing you here, you can see that for the legumes, as is generally known, they have lower NDF and lower ADF value compared to the grass component. And they were also basically lower than the mixtures, which I'll talk a little bit about later. So once you find it happening, you find that generally the legumes are of greater, call it generally forage quality compared to the monoculture grasses and even the mixture, which I'll talk about. So like for the faba bean, the winter pea, and the yellow sweet clover, if you were to plant them as monocultures, then you can expect, values in relation to premium, good and fair feed quality. The legume, like yellow sweet clover, as it matures, it tends to get a little bit more woody. And with that, you'll have increase in ADF and NDF concentration and overall lower relative feed value. Now, so we know that generally legumes are greater in nutritive value than grasses. So there's no dispute there. But what happens in relation to the mixtures? Because the mixtures are basically the same in terms of relative feed value like the grasses. But the mixtures include legumes, 50% legumes. So let me say this clearly to you. If you're thinking of forage quality, you have to be very careful with the species combination, because sometimes what you find happening, or a lot of times, not some, but a lot of times what you find happening with this competition for growth resources, the grass can oftentimes dominate that mixture. And so when you find that that legume component in the sward or the mixture fall below 30%, you'll find no significant increase in the overall nutritive value or this forage quality index that we're talking about. So when we went out there and we did our botanical composition to understand the species mixtures, then basically the legume component was lower than 30% in the mixture. Hence the reason for no difference in terms of relative feed value for the annual ryegrass or oats monoculture compared to the mixtures. So what is the lesson learned here? That maybe you need to reconsider if you're going to focus on feeding value, increase the feeding rate of the legume in the mixture. That is one consideration. But you can juxtapose that with the overall greater biomass. And so you might be a producer who want to make sure you're not so, keen on forage quality. So you want to make sure that you have sufficient feed for your animal. Then maybe you might perhaps like decide, I'm going to keep it the same way it is in terms of biomass production focus rather than the combination of biomass and nutritive value focus. So again, for these cover crops, you have to think, you have to think first and foremost your main objective. Whether if you're going to focus on the soil health parameters or you're going to focus on the combination of both soil health and also nutritive value or forage feeding, animal feeding value of the cover crop. So here I'm presenting to you the microbial community structure for the different cover crop systems. What I can tell you from this data, from total microbial biomass to separating bacteria into gram-negative and gram-positive, to the fungal component, to the actinomyces and the mycorrhizal fungi and saprophytes and so on, all very important. They were not different for the different cover crop systems. So cover crop system did not influence the microbial community structure. Now, what I can tell you, because I'm going to summarize later, don't expect with these soil health parameters to see immediate benefits a lot of times. But if you look at the initial measurement, clearly we saw an improvement in terms of the overall microbial community compared to the initial measurement. Now, we still have to be careful here too, because, there is, temporal and spatial implication when it comes to these soil microbial community structure. So it depends on your time of sampling and so on, it can differ, and so that needs to take into consideration. And so I like to focus more on the system. So overall, what I'll urge you to do if your focus is primarily on soil health, and we know that cover crops are very beneficial for soil health, then be patient. Don't expect to see, you plant the cover crop today and you see changes tomorrow. There are times when you'll see immediate impact in relation to soil health changes as a result of cover crop integration, but generally speaking, it is on a long-term basis. Okay, another key component we look at is the soil CO2 respiration for different cover crop systems. Okay, and so what we've seen here basically for these different cover crop systems, right? I want to highlight here is that the yellow sweet clover, which is the monoculture legume, right? Greater CO2 respiration compared to the fallow. Same can be said for winter pea, and same can be said for annual ryegrass. So in other words, what it's telling you that this is indicative of greater microbial activities, which is an indication of soil health, under some form of cover crop, particularly for yellow sweet clover and maybe annual ryegrass, and winter pea compared to the fallow. The fallow is where you just leave the bare ground. There is no cover there. And so this further maybe justify the need for the integration of cover crop into your system instead of a bare ground fallow, because you're seeing maybe some immediate improvement in relation to soil health compared to the bare ground fallow system there. So here are some take-home messages, basically. The cover crop mixture 2, which we talk about here, which is oat and faba bean and winter pea. And I want you to remember, these are not fixed. If you were to select a cover crop mixture, pay keen attention to your environment. Focus on the purposes that you want out of the cover crop before you make that selection. But here I'm providing you with, some option. And that cover crop mixture ranked among the greatest in terms of biomass production at both early and late termination. So that is important. The other thing that I want you to pay attention to is that except for faba bean and winter pea, all other cover crop systems produce greater biomass at late than early. So it tells you one thing here, that the faba bean and winter pea, they mature early. And as a result of that, if you're not going to plant, something early there or terminate early, and you decide to terminate late, you can face the possibility of great risk in terms of increase in the weed population. And so that can be harmful for your next crop or cost a lot of money in order to, clear that out from there for your next crop. The other thing that I want, well, I kind of mentioned that, but particularly the winter pea biomass at late harvest, I mentioned that before, indicates early maturity and high risk of weed invasion if harvested late. So you take that into consideration, okay? The root biomass tended to be greater for the cover crop mixture 1 than oat as a monoculture and faba bean. So it kind of tells you here, if you think about, soil organic matter, you think about, maybe reduction in soil compaction, then perhaps you might want to consider, the mixture compared to the monoculture of either the grass or legume component. And then if we think about the animal feeding value, right, always favors the legume, faba bean, winter pea, and sweet clover. But again, if you think of overall biomass production, then you might want to think of the inclusion of, the inclusion of grass basically is very, very important because there, I don't want to go deeper into the nutritional, complexities for inclusion of grass compared to a pure legume diet. But we know that there are, major nutritional issues sometimes when animals are fed pure legume diet. And so that is why, inclusion of grass will be very important. That fiber, very important. So take that into consideration. Then the soil health parameters, right? We measure bulk density, very important. We look at infiltration rate. We look at cone index, which is basically a measure of compaction, and we look at aggregate stability. They did not differ under the different cover crop systems. Okay? What I want to urge you here again is that this is after year one. It needs time to see differences in relation to these, or the impact of the cover crop systems maybe compared to a bare ground fallow. So it takes time. And so that is something that you need to take into consideration, that you need to be patient. Also, I want to make this clear here. Method of, land preparation for sowing of cover crop can also alter, these soil health parameters quite a lot. And so based on studies, we know that under no-till system, there is more rapid impact in terms of improvement in these soil health parameters compared to conventional tillage. So that you can take into consideration too. When we look at the soil microbial categories, they did not differ under the different cover crop systems, right? But again, I kind of show you that there is some improvement from the initial measurement compared to, under the cover crop system at the end of the season. But I did point out that there's spatial and temporal issues in relation to soil microbes. And so we have to be careful in terms of drawing final conclusion there. Right, and so we talk about soil respiration, which, is indicative of soil microbial activities. So what we saw basically, like yellow sweet clover system compared to cover crop mixture 1, oat, faba bean, and fallow system, it kind of indicates the potential for greater soil health. So under that yellow sweet clover system. And so maybe from that perspective, you might want to think, okay, well, then if that is the case, then maybe I can include a greater proportion of that yellow sweet clover in the mixture. Okay, so you take that into consideration. So from this particular study, we basically observe, or the results indicate, that there are potential benefits of incorporating cover crops in semi-arid environment like ours here in Nevada. So that should be taken into consideration. And now, so I like to go to the next study. And so here we kind of change up things a little bit because, so we talk about, the grass, and then we talk about the legumes in that one. But here, and it's the same objective, so I'm not going to, try to go through that back again. But under this study, we use rye this time instead of oats. Okay, and we include arrowleaf clover, we include white sweet clover, we include 2 broadleaves, basically forage kale and winter lentils. Okay, and then we have the mixtures, so like mixture 1, rye, arrowleaf clover, and winter lentil. And so for mixture 2, we have rye, white sweet clover, and forage kale. Now, you have to take into consideration the morphological characteristics, as I mentioned earlier, in relation to these cover crops. Because if you think of something like forage kale, for example, pretty broad leaves. So we'll talk about that in relation. And these are the species and the seeding rate used and so on for these cover crops. Okay, so the data collection, more or less the same. So I will not go over that. But let's look, this is one plot here of forage kale. So it tells you something immediately in terms, if you look at this plot carefully, and this is I took this picture basically coming on to the end when it started to really die. And so if you look here, basically, there is minimal weed invasion in this plot, which is a good thing because, forage kale, because of the nature of the leaf. And, something else I should mention, apart from these, the physical characteristics in terms of leaf morphology and, their suppressive ability in terms of biomass, some of these forage or these cover crops can produce what we call allelochemicals, or they have allelopathic effect that can actually suppress weed growth. And so that can be taken into consideration when selecting your cover crops for inclusion in your system. So here we have rye, arrowleaf clover, white sweet clover, forage kale, and winter lentil, and the two mixtures that I've mentioned. If we look at biomass production, right, again, in this case, there was no difference across the different systems for biomass production. So essentially, from a biomass perspective, you can tell yourself that, I can select just about any system and use it. However, I want you to also think closely about your intended focus. And, maybe what I'll argue that, cover crop mixtures overall might be more suitable than monoculture of either a legume, a grass, or a broadleaf, as in the case of forage kale or winter lentils. Okay, so, and the bulk density. And so if we look now at bulk density, which basically equates the biomass production per unit of plant height, clearly, if you look at forage kale, for example, winter lentil, for example, you can see that they have proportionally higher bulk density compared to, the other cover crop systems. And so that can be taken into consideration. And if you look, this is a plot of white sweet clover. And then again, you can see, so, we relate, the bulk density to weeds again. And I want to emphasize that because weeds is, it's really been problematic. And so we know that from that point of view, they have good suppressive ability in terms of weed control in your field. All right. So here we went underground, as I show pictures here now compared to before. And we dig up the root systems and we quantified it basically. And so here you can think of, the soil, penetration for reduction of compaction. You can think of, soil organic matter contribution and so on. But, from this basically study, there was no difference in terms of root biomass across the different cover crop systems. So in this case, maybe if you want to think from the data point of view, you might think that, well, then again, just about any one of the system, be it the monoculture or the mixture, can be utilized for cover crop, my cover crop system. Okay. Like before, I covered the ADF and NDF, and I talk about the relationship of ADF and digestibility and the relationship of NDF, neutral detergent fiber, and forage intake. And so, as I mentioned, if you have increased ADF concentration, you have a reduction in digestibility, so lower energy provision for the animal. If you have an increase in NDF concentration, higher the NDF concentration, lower the intake capability. So you have, it's more bulky. So you have, like in the case of cattle, for example, you have greater room and fill. So they reach, what we call satiety, so that degree of fullness, not because it's nutritionally full, but there is that physical distension of the rumen. And so it signals to the brain to stop eating. But nutritionally, those animals are still starved. So that is how we utilize these parameters to help us as indicator of forage quality. Now, if you look at forage kale, for example, lower overall ADF and NDF concentration than the other forage systems. And so if you look at white sweet clover, which is somewhat, thing at, for ADF concentration, white sweet clover had greater ADF concentration than the cover crop mixture 1 and cover crop mixture 2, and the rye and arrowleaf clover. The thing is with white sweet clover, it gets a little woody or stemmy. And so obviously that will reduce or increase the ADF concentration and the bulkiness, the nutrient detergent fiber concentration of the forage. So overall, you can expect lower forage quality. Now, I put this up here just to show you that, we know that if you harvest early because of the maturity stage, actually, you have lower ADF and NDF concentration compared to late across all the systems. So as a farmer, if you're going to use this cover crop system basically for animal feeding, then you want to think of your termination date. As a gardener or just someone focused on soil health, then you can consider maybe terminating late compared to early. Or if you plan to put in a subsequent crop, then you have to think of summer crop, for example. Then you have to think about that summer crop in relation to consideration when you terminate your cover crop. Now, so for the cover crops, okay, when we look at the relative feed value, again, this is utilizing, alfalfa basically standard, right? I want to show you that arrowleaf clover, for example, ranked supreme at early harvest. Forage kale ranks supreme at early harvest. And even at late harvest, forage kale was supreme. So in other words, what it's telling you, that forage kale holds its forage nutritive value or quality over the season. It don't decline rapidly compared to, the traditional grass monoculture or something like that. If you look at arrowleaf clover, however, for example, it kind of declined from supreme to utility during late harvest. So it tells you that even arrowleaf clover, as the time extended in terms of termination date, you have increased maturity, increased stemminess of that crop, and therefore a reduction or an increase in the ADF and NDF concentration, and a reduction in the potential forage quality of arrowleaf clover. So you have to take that into consideration. Now, I kind of point out here that, when you look across the termination date for early versus late for each system, so basically for rye, it did not differ. If you harvest late or compare if you harvest early in relation to relative feed value, right? So you take that into consideration. If you look at winter lentil, for example, it declined from premium early to utility. So it started to decline rapidly. So it tells you that maybe for a winter lentil, if I'm thinking about forage quality for my animal, then perhaps I need to harvest early. And for the cover crop mixture, they generally did not differ in terms of relative, these two mixtures across the termination date, they did not differ in terms of relative feed value. So that information too, you can take into consideration in relation to your integration of cover cropping systems, right? Into your thing. So again, when we look at the soil health parameters, and we cover bulk density, slake, and all of them. When we look at the soil health parameters, the soil microbial community structure, total microbial biomass, bacteria, gram-negative fungi, actinomyces, the arbuscular mycorrhizae, the saprophytes, and so on. They did not differ among cover crop systems used. Again, but you see generally an increase compared to that initial measurement. And again, I want to plead to you to be careful that even though you see that increase, there are spatiotemporal implication in relation to soil microbial activities and cover crops. And so what happens basically that, there's no rapid increase or change compared maybe to a bare ground fallow, right? In a short period of time, it occurs over time. So it's incremental. So take that into consideration in relation to things. So here are some take-home messages, basically, right? When we think about biomass production for this study, for these cover crop systems, the second one, they were not different and neither influenced by termination date. If we use biomass bulk density as an indicator of weed suppression potential, it was greater for forage kale and winter lentil in this study. And so that can take into consideration if you think that, I need to control weeds too. The root biomass here was kind of similar. So it tells you that maybe, just maybe, that, it might be more beneficial to go with a mixture instead of a monoculture of either. And forage kale rank lowest in ADF and NDF concentration for those who would think about animal feeding value of these cover crops, right? And if you go like from early harvest, the relative feed value was supreme for forage kale, early and late harvest, and arrowleaf clover. However, only for forage kale had a relative feed value that ranked, supreme when harvest late. So it tells you that forage kale, maintains basically its relative feed quality regardless of the termination date. And so that is very important from an animal production standpoint. So again, just to reiterate that, generally sampling period or termination date did not affect the relative feed value of rye, white sweet clover, and that cover crop mixture 1 and 2. If we think of soil bulk density, aggregate stability, and cone index, which is a measure of the soil compaction, it did not differ among crop systems. And I decided not to show this data because it did not differ. And it's more a teaching class rather than a mere scientific presentation. What we saw, however, that soil water infiltration rate was greater for rye compared to all other cover crop systems. If this result can repeat itself, then we can think of rye a little bit differently. And so maybe there might be a call to ensure the inclusion of rye in your cover crop mixture. When we look at the soil microbial community and soil CO2 respiration, which is an indication of microbial activities, they did not differ among cover crop systems. And what I want to urge you here, sometimes the likelihood of seeing these differences immediately are very, very, very slim, but it's over time. And so that is why you have to be patient with these cover crop systems. So even though this is the first year of data collection, this study, or both studies basically provide some fundamental information for you to consider when selecting a cover crop system, be it for ecosystem services or the inclusion of animal feeding value in water limited environment like ours. Okay, so before I kind of close, one thing I like to talk about is that it is possible to grow cover crops here like other parts of the country without irrigation. So your planting date, maybe you might decide that I want to plant in the spring. We're able to make use of a little bit more moisture compared to fall planting. That is for you to decide upon, okay? But irrigation will still be very critical for the production of cover crops under our environment. And so I will close by saying that the impact of cover crops on most soil health parameters generally require an extended period of time. And so with that, I would like to close, and I thank you very much for listening to me in relation to winter cover crops, soil health, and forage quality benefits. Thank you.